The sound of laughter spilled from the upstairs bathroom, her laughter, joined by a voice I didn't recognize. I paused mid-step on the staircase, groceries balanced awkwardly in my arms, straining to make sense of what I was hearing.
Nancy wasn't alone. Nancy? I called out.
The laughter cut off abruptly, replaced by the quick shuffle of feet and the muffled closing of a door. I froze, my heartbeat picking up its pace. A strange mix of curiosity and dread settled over me, a feeling I couldn't immediately place.
We lived alone. There shouldn't have been anyone else upstairs.
Setting the groceries down on the kitchen counter, I climbed the rest of the stairs, slow and deliberate. Every creak of the wood beneath my feet felt deafening. When I reached the bathroom, the door was shut tight, and there was silence on the other side.
I knocked. Nancy?
I'm in the bath, she said, her voice muffled.
Can you give me a second?
Her tone was calm, casual, but something about it didn't sit right with me. I leaned closer to the door, hesitating.
Who were you talking to?
There was a pause, just long enough for me to hear my own pulse in my ears. Then she laughed again, this time forced and hollow.
What are you talking about? I wasn't talking to anyone. I knew what I'd heard. This wasn't paranoia. It wasn't some figment of my imagination.
My wife, the woman I'd loved and trusted for more than a decade, was lying to me.
And I wasn't going to let it slide. Open the door, Nancy.
There was a clatter, like someone knocking over a bottle. Daniel, you're being ridiculous, she said, her voice tinged with irritation.
I'll be out in a minute. I didn't wait. I reached for the handle, only to find it locked. Nancy.
My voice was sharper this time, a demand rather than a request. I'm naked, she snapped, her irritation giving way to something closer to panic. That's when I noticed the faintest scuff mark at the base of the door. Fresh, as if someone had moved quickly and carelessly on their way out.
Who's in there with you?
I asked, my throat tightening around the words.
For a moment, there was nothing but silence. And then the sound of running water. Daniel, I told you, I'm alone. Stop being so weird. I didn't believe her. Not for a second. I couldn't get the sound out of my head, that second voice.
It wasn't one I'd ever heard in this house before, and it sure as hell didn't belong to me. When Nancy finally emerged from the bathroom, wrapped in her favorite towel with her hair slicked back, she looked as casual as if nothing had happened. Are you just going to stand there glaring at me all day? She asked, her tone laced with impatience.
Who was in there? I asked directly. No room for ambiguity. No games.
Her face scrunched up in a frown, as though I'd just accused her of something preposterous.
What are you talking about? Nobody was in there, Daniel. It's just me.
It was the way she said it, too quick, too defensive. It wasn't the first time I'd seen her lie. She was a terrible liar, always had been, and I knew all her tells. The slight twitch of her left eye, the way her hand fidgeted with the edge of her towel, the quickness of her response as if she had to shut me down before I could dig further.
I didn't respond. Instead, I walked past her into the bathroom. What are you doing? She demanded, following me. The bathroom looked normal enough at first glance, but I wasn't convinced.
The air was warm and humid from the shower, and the scent of her lavender soap was strong. But then I saw it, a white cotton hand towel on the counter, damp and crumpled.
We always used different towels, and this one wasn't mine. Nancy, whose towel is this?
She crossed her arms over her chest.
It's mine. Obviously. Yours? You use the purple one. Always.
So whose is this? God, Daniel, it's just a towel, she snapped.
Why are you being so weird today? I didn't press further right then.
I wanted to, but I could feel the rage building inside me, and I needed a moment to collect myself.
This wasn't over.
The next day, I decided to pay closer attention. I was meticulous about my routine, go to work, come home, have dinner, and wind down, but now I started paying more attention to hers. Nancy had a habit of leaving her keys on the kitchen counter, and that morning, as she was getting ready for work, I noticed she'd added something new to her keychain, a fob. Small, black, and distinctly unfamiliar.
"What's that?" I asked, nodding toward it.
What's what?
"That."
I pointed directly at the fob. Oh, she said with a laugh that felt forced.
"It's for the gym. They upgraded their system. Everyone gets one now. We had a small gym in town, nothing fancy."
I'd been there a few times myself, and I knew for a fact they hadn't upgraded anything in years.
But I didn't say that. "Not yet."
Cool, I said instead, forcing a smile.
That evening, I decided to follow her. She left around 7 p.m., saying she had a yoga class at the gym. That wasn't unusual, she'd been into yoga for the past few months, and I'd never questioned it before. But now I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I waited a few minutes before grabbing my keys and heading out.
Her car was parked at the gym, just like she'd said it would be.
But when I went inside, she wasn't there.
I checked the main floor, the yoga studio, even the locker rooms as discreetly as I could.
No Nancy. I went back outside and waited.
20 minutes later, she came out, hair perfectly styled, makeup intact, and not a drop of sweat on her. She wasn't carrying her yoga mat, either.
I followed her again.
This time, she drove across town to a building I didn't recognize. It was one of those unmarked places, the kind you wouldn't notice unless you were looking for it. She parked, walked up to the door, and let herself in using that new fob on her keychain. I stayed in my car, my heart pounding in my chest. What the hell was this place?
The next morning, I did some digging. I spent hours searching for any clue about the building she'd gone into.
It turned out to be a private medical office, not one of the big hospitals or well-known clinics, but a small, discreet practice owned by a single doctor, Dr. Carter. Her gynecologist. The pieces started falling into place, but I wasn't ready to accept what they were forming.
It didn't make sense.
Nancy had been seeing Dr. Carter for years. He was older, married, and I'd never had any reason to suspect anything inappropriate.
But now I did.
The breakthrough came when I decided to confront her schedule directly. That evening, while she was in the shower, I grabbed her planner from the kitchen counter. Nancy was old-fashioned like that, she preferred writing things down over using her phone's calendar. Flipping through the pages, I saw her weekly yoga classes neatly marked, along with other errands and appointments.
But there was one recurring entry that caught my attention: Carter, 7 p.m. Every Tuesday and Thursday for the past 2 months. I felt like I was going to be sick. The woman I thought I knew better than anyone else in the world had been lying to me. And the lies weren't small, innocent ones. They were the kind that could shatter everything we'd built together. I put the planner back where I found it and waited. I needed more proof. Something undeniable. The following evening, I prepared myself. I wasn't sure what would come of this, but I knew I couldn't sit on the sidelines anymore. If she was lying to me, if my suspicions were even half correct, I needed to get the truth. Nancy had another Carter, 7 p.m. entry in her planner for that night. I decided to follow her again. She left the house at 6:30 p.m., just as she had the previous times. I waited a few minutes before heading out, giving her enough time to believe she was alone. When I reached the building, I parked down the street and approached on foot, staying out of sight. The entrance was a single glass door with blinds drawn tightly over the windows. There was no receptionist, no waiting area visible, just a dimly lit hallway stretching beyond the door. I waited until I saw her car leave 2 hours later. Then I walked up to the door and pulled. It didn't budge. Locked. That damn fob was the only way in. I knew that direct confrontation was my only option now. There was no use in more waiting, no point in gathering further circumstantial evidence. That night, as Nancy came home, I sat in the living room, lights dimmed, waiting for her. She walked in with her usual calm demeanor, carrying her gym bag, her hair still perfectly styled as if she'd been nowhere near a yoga mat. "Hey," she said when she saw me. "Why are you sitting here in the dark?" I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees. "Where were you, Nancy?"
She paused, setting her bag down by the door.
What do you mean?
I told you I was at yoga. Her tone was casual, dismissive, the same as it always was when she thought I was being overly inquisitive.
No, you weren't, I said. I went to the gym.
You weren't there. Her expression faltered for a moment before she caught herself.
Why were you at the gym? Are you checking up on me now?
I stood up, my heart racing.
I followed you to Dr. Carter's office. I saw you go in.
Her face went pale. You've been lying to me, I continued, my voice steady despite the storm brewing inside me.
Every Tuesday and Thursday, you've been going there.
For what?
What are you doing, Nancy?
She looked down, avoiding my gaze. It's not what you think, she said finally.
Then tell me what it is.
There was a long silence. The kind that stretched so far it felt like it might never end. Then she looked up, her eyes filled with something I couldn't quite place: fear, shame, maybe even defiance. It's personal, she said.
Personal?
I repeated, anger seeping into my voice now.
We're married. Nothing about this is personal. If it's not what I think, then tell me what it is.
She hesitated again, and that was all the confirmation I needed. I want the truth, I said, taking a step closer to her.
No excuses. No lies. Just tell me the truth.
Fine, she snapped, throwing her hands up in frustration.
You want the truth? I've been seeing him. Happy now?
The words hit me like a physical blow, but I didn't flinch.
For how long?
I asked, my voice low.
Does it matter? She shot back, her tone defensive now. It's over. It's done. How long, Nancy?
She sighed, running a hand through her hair. A couple of months, she admitted. I felt a wave of anger and disbelief wash over me, but I forced myself to stay calm.
Why? She looked at me like I'd just asked the dumbest question in the world.
Because he listened to me, she said.
Because he made me feel wanted.
Because he wasn't always distracted or wrapped up in his own world. Her words stung, but they didn't justify what she'd done.
So this is my fault? I asked.
No, she said quickly.
It's not your fault. But it's not all my fault either. You've been distant for months, Daniel.
I tried to talk to you, but you didn't care. You just drifted. That's bullshit, I said, my voice rising.
You didn't try to talk to me. You lied to me. You snuck around behind my back, and now you're blaming me for it?
I'm not blaming you, she yelled, tears streaming down her face now.
I'm just trying to explain.
Well, don't bother, I snapped.
There's no excuse for this. None.
She stood there, crying silently, but I didn't feel sorry for her.
Not this time.
The rest of the night passed in a haze of silence. She retreated to the bedroom, and I stayed on the couch, staring at the ceiling and replaying the conversation in my head over and over again.
By morning, I knew what I had to do. This wasn't something I could forgive. It wasn't something I could forget.
And it damn sure wasn't something I could live with.
The tension in the house was unbearable in the days following Nancy's confession.
We barely spoke, and when we did, the words were clipped and sharp.
The silence between us wasn't just awkward, it was heavy.
It weighed on me, pressing down with every passing minute.
Soon, the family celebration loomed, a big event at Nancy's parents' house.
It was her father's 60th birthday, and the entire family was coming together. I had half a mind to skip it altogether, but I knew Nancy wouldn't let that happen without raising questions. You're still coming, right? She asked as we prepared that morning.
I didn't look at her. Do I have a choice?
She sighed, clearly exasperated.
Don't start, Daniel. It's Dad's birthday.
I just want one day without all this mess hanging over us. She said it like she wasn't the one who caused the mess. Like her actions weren't the reason our marriage was in ruins. I wanted to scream at her, to remind her exactly why things were the way they were, but I held my tongue.
Fine, I said, my voice flat.
We drove to her parents' house in silence. She fiddled with her phone the entire way, avoiding even a glance in my direction. The house was already buzzing with activity when we arrived. Her parents greeted us at the door, her mom pulling me into a warm hug.
"Daniel, it's so good to see you," she said. "You've been working too hard. Look at you, skinny as a rail." I forced a smile and mumbled something polite. My mind wasn't on small talk. Inside, the atmosphere was festive. Balloons and banners filled the living room, and the smell of roast beef wafted from the kitchen. Nancy's siblings and their spouses were already there, along with a handful of aunts, uncles, and cousins. Everyone was laughing, chatting, and catching up. Nancy slipped into the crowd easily, her charm in full force. She hugged her sisters, exchanged jokes with her cousins, and even managed to make her dad laugh within seconds of greeting him. Watching her, you'd think nothing was wrong. But I knew better. I kept to myself for most of the afternoon, nursing a beer and making polite conversation when necessary. I could feel Nancy's eyes on me occasionally, watching to see if I was going to cause a scene. I hadn't planned it, not exactly, but as the day went on, the anger inside me grew. Seeing her act like everything was fine, like she hadn't betrayed me, made my blood boil. By the time dinner rolled around, I'd had enough. We were all gathered around the long dining table, plates piled high with food. Nancy was sitting to my right, laughing at something her brother-in-law said. Her parents sat at the head of the table, beaming at their children and grandchildren. I cleared my throat, and the conversation around me quieted. "I'd like to say something," I announced. Nancy froze, her fork halfway to her mouth. Her dad smiled. "Of course, Daniel. What's on your mind?" I looked around the table, meeting each person's gaze in turn. "I think it's important for everyone here to know the truth about what's been going on in our lives." "Daniel," Nancy said quickly, her voice low and warning. I ignored her. "Nancy and I are having difficulties," I continued. "Serious difficulties. And I think the family deserves to know why." The room was silent now, all eyes on me. "Daniel, stop," Nancy hissed. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with panic. I turned to her. "Why? You weren't worried about secrecy when you were sneaking around with Dr. Carter, were you?" The room erupted. Gasps, murmurs, the clatter of a dropped fork. Nancy's mother looked like she was about to faint. "Daniel, that's enough." Nancy's dad barked. But I wasn't done. "For months, she's been lying to me. To all of us," I said, my voice shaking with anger. "While I thought she was at yoga, she was meeting him. While I was working to keep our lives together, she was destroying everything we built." Nancy stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "Can we talk about this privately?" she snapped, her voice trembling. "No," I said firmly. "We're done keeping this private. You didn't think about privacy when you decided to cheat on me, so why should I protect you now?" Her sisters were whispering to each other, their faces a mix of shock and disbelief. Her mom had tears in her eyes. Nancy's dad slammed his hand on the table, cutting through the noise. "Enough," he said, his voice booming. "Both of you, outside. Now." The argument continued on the front porch, away from the stunned silence inside. Nancy was crying now, her voice rising in desperation. "How could you do that?" she demanded. "How could you humiliate me like that in front of my family? How could you cheat on me?" I shot back. "How could you humiliate me, our marriage, in the worst way possible?" Her dad stepped between us, his face red with anger. "Both of you need to stop this nonsense right now. You're adults. Act like it." But there was no calming me down. Not this time. The fallout was immediate. Nancy stayed with her parents that night, too embarrassed to face me. I drove home alone, the silence in the car feeling heavier than it ever had before. I didn't regret what I'd done. Maybe it wasn't the most tactful way to handle things, but she'd humiliated me first. She'd lied, betrayed me, and now everyone knew it. The next step was clear. Divorce.
There was no coming back from this, and I wasn't going to let her drag me through any more of her mess.
The revenge wasn't complete yet.
There were still things to settle.
Nancy came home the next morning.
Her car pulled into the driveway slowly, as if she was hoping I wouldn't notice. I was sitting at the dining table, my untouched coffee in front of me. I heard the engine cut off, then the hesitant click of the front door unlocking. She stepped inside, her face still blotchy from crying, her shoulders hunched like a child caught sneaking out. For a moment, she just stood there, staring at me.
"We need to talk," she said finally. I gestured to the chair across from me.
She hesitated but sat down.
"Say what you need to say," I told her, my voice flat. She took a deep breath.
"I'm sorry for what I did, Daniel."
"I really am." "Sorry for cheating, or sorry you got caught?"
I asked, not bothering to hide the edge in my voice.
Her eyes flicked down to the table.
"Both," she admitted quietly. I leaned back in my chair, folding my arms.
"Why? Why did you do it?"
She looked up at me then, her eyes glassy with unshed tears.
"Because between us, there's nothing anymore.
No passion, no excitement.
I've felt it for years, and I didn't know how to fix it. I was
trying to find a way to compensate for what was missing.
I felt the anger rise in me again.
So instead of talking to me, instead of trying to fix our marriage, you decided to screw your gynecologist?
That was your solution?"
"It wasn't like that," she said quickly, her voice defensive.
"I didn't plan for it to happen. It just did." I scoffed. "Don't give me that 'it just happened' crap.
Affairs don't just happen.
You made a choice, Nancy. Every step of the way, you made a choice."
She was crying now, but I didn't feel sorry for her.
"Not anymore."
"I was lonely," she said through her tears.
"You were so distant, so detached. I didn't feel like you wanted me anymore."
I stared at her, disbelief washing over me.
"Detached? Nancy, I've been here. Every day.
I've been here, trying to keep this family together while you were out screwing around.
Don't you dare turn this around on me."
"I'm not," she said quickly. "I'm just trying to explain how I felt."
It wasn't about hurting you. It wasn't even about him. It was about feeling alive again." "Feeling alive?"
I repeated, my voice rising.
"So, what? I was supposed to sit here and rot while you went out feeling alive?" She didn't answer.
She just sat there, crying silently, and for the first time, I saw her for what she really was, selfish. "I'm done, Nancy," I said finally. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with panic.
"What do you mean?" "I mean I'm done.
Done with you, done with this marriage, done pretending like we can fix something you already destroyed." "You don't mean that," she said quickly.
"We can go to counseling. We can fix this." "No, we can't," I said firmly. "Because I can't trust you. And without trust, there's nothing left to fix."
She reached across the table, grabbing my hand.
"Please, Daniel. Don't do this. I made a mistake, but we can work through it. We've been together too long to throw it all away." I pulled my hand back. "You threw it away, Nancy. The second you decided that feeling alive was more important than your husband, you threw it away."
Her face crumpled, and she began sobbing.
"I love you," she choked out. "No, you don't," I said coldly. "If you loved me, you wouldn't have done this. You don't cheat on someone you love."
She cried for what felt like an eternity, but I didn't move.
I didn't comfort her. I couldn't.
Finally, she wiped her eyes and looked at me, her face streaked with mascara.
"What happens now?" "I'm filing for divorce," I said simply.
"I'll talk to a lawyer tomorrow. You can stay in the house until we figure out the logistics, but I'm done." "Please, Daniel," she said again, her voice desperate.
"Don't do this."
"It's already done," I said, standing up.
"You just didn't realize it until now."
I went upstairs, leaving her at the table.
I didn't look back.
I didn't want to see her tears, her regret, her shame.
I didn't want to see any of it. That night, I packed a bag and stayed with a friend.
I didn't tell her where I was going, and I didn't answer her calls. I needed space, needed to think about what came next. The last thing I said to her before I left was this.
You wanted to feel alive, Nancy. Congratulations. You've never killed something faster.
The next few weeks passed like a whirlwind, each day a new chapter in the dismantling of what had once been my life.
I moved out completely, renting a modest apartment.
Nancy stayed in the house, which we both knew would eventually be sold once the divorce was finalized. She called me often at first, leaving long voicemails, her voice thick with tears. She begged me to come home, to reconsider, to let her explain herself again. Each time I listened, the messages grew more desperate, her words circling the same empty promises of change and regret. I stopped picking up, then eventually stopped listening to the messages altogether.
Divorce proceedings began almost immediately.
I met with a lawyer, a sharp woman who had no patience for theatrics and no tolerance for games. She asked me direct questions about our finances, the circumstances of Nancy's affair, and my goals for the divorce.
I want it over as fast as possible, I told her.
I don't care about the house or the stuff.
I just want a clean break. She raised an eyebrow at me. You might want to reconsider that, she said.
You're entitled to your share, and walking away from it all won't make this any easier.
But I was resolute. I don't want anything from her, I said. I just want out. The process wasn't simple. Nancy contested the divorce initially, pleading for counseling instead.
But when it became clear that I wasn't budging, she finally agreed to move forward. We divided our assets down the middle, split the proceeds from the sale of the house, and went our separate ways. The anger had faded somewhat, replaced by a dull, persistent sadness. There was no joy in ending a 15-year marriage, no satisfaction in seeing Nancy reduced to a shadow of her former self. But there was relief.
Nancy's family wasn't quiet during all this. Her father, a man I'd always respected, called me one evening. Daniel, it's Frank, he said, his tone hesitant. Hey, Frank, I replied. I just wanted to say I'm sorry, he said. For everything. For what Nancy did.
We raised her better than that.
I didn't know how to respond to that. It's not your fault, I said finally.
No, but it's my problem, he said. You've been like a son to me all these years.
Watching her ruin what you two had, it's been hard to stomach.
There was a long pause before he spoke again.
Whatever happens next, just know you've still got family here, he said.
I thanked him and hung up, feeling a wave of unexpected gratitude.
Nancy and I had one last conversation before everything was finalized.
She asked to meet in person, and against my better judgment, I agreed.
We met at a park near the house, sitting on a bench in the cool autumn air.
She looked tired, older than I remembered.
Thank you for coming, she said softly. I nodded but didn't say anything.
I know I've said this a million times, but I'm sorry, she continued.
I don't expect you to forgive me. I just needed to say it again. I believe you're sorry, I said finally. But that doesn't change what you did.
She nodded, tears brimming in her eyes.
I know, she whispered.
There was a long silence between us before she spoke again.
I never stopped loving you, she said. Even when I did what I did, I still loved you. I shook my head. You don't do that to someone you love, Nancy. Maybe you thought you loved me, but not in a way that mattered.
She broke down then, crying quietly into her hands.
I didn't comfort her. I couldn't.
When she finally composed herself, she looked at me with red-rimmed eyes.
Do you hate me? She asked. I thought about it for a moment. No, I said honestly. I don't hate you. But I don't love you either. Not anymore.
She nodded slowly, as if she'd expected that answer but needed to hear it anyway.
Goodbye, Daniel, she said finally. Goodbye, Nancy, I replied. And that was it.
I'm still figuring out what comes next, still adjusting to the quiet of an apartment without Nancy in it. But there's a strange kind of peace in the quiet. It's not happiness, not yet, but it's the first step. Nancy sent me one last message after the divorce was finalized. "I hope you find someone who can give you what I couldn't," it read.
I didn't respond. There wasn't anything left to say.